Nuclear bombs, the most devastating weapon ever created by human hands. They were used to end World War II, dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I believe the quote is, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The most fitting quote for these destructive weapons of atomic energy. In the 1960s, we began a Cold War with Russia and came closer to destroying ourselves than ever before. The nuclear freeze movement was the only thing willing to combat the near-total atomic annihilation. It was an organization of people fighting for a better tomorrow, for their tomorrow. Today, we will look at these people willing to fight for their tomorrow. We will explore their leadership and its influence, how the government dealt with this new peace activism, and what effects their riots had, and finally, the conflicts and compromises that came from this new idea. This is my NHD National History Day project on the nuclear freeze and peace activism of the 1980s. While some people were creating and stocking their bomb shelters, others began to riot against the construction of massive nuclear arsenals. This movement soon became known as the nuclear freeze movement. The person who coined the idea was Dr. Randall Caroline Forsberg. Dr. Randall Caroline Forsberg, born July 23, 1943, was a very bright individual from the beginning. She attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and there she began to work on stopping the spread of nuclear and biological weapons. Eventually, when the nuclear freeze movement began, she soon became their proclaimed leader. However, the organized events were always made by the people. The groups were led simply by the people who invested and the people who organized the events within their community. There was no real form of government, but there wasn't anarchy, as there was an organization. It was simply an organized riot, led by those who put the most into the organization, whether it be information or money. Now that we know how the nuclear freeze organization was led, we will look at how the president reacted to it. We will now discuss our second topic. How did President Ronald Reagan and the Reagan Foundation deal with the nuclear freeze? Reagan and the Reagan Foundation did not agree with the newfound idea of the nuclear freeze. The main opposition was the Reagan Foundation. They believed a nuclear freeze would leave the U.S. weak against Russia and the Soviet Union, and instead fought for the continued production and the construction of nuclear missiles. The nuclear freeze movement was beginning to gain traction, and they held their largest movement, the largest in U.S. history, on June 12, 1982. The New York nuclear freeze riot was held. Later, as Reagan's term was nearing an end, he was set to be re-elected. However, the nuclear freeze was growing very popular in the polls, and so Reagan decided to state, without evidence, that the Soviet Union had manipulated the nuclear freeze campaign from the start to get the Americans while they were under freeze laws. However, this was disproved, and no evidence was ever found to support his claim. To flip this on its head, though, in Reagan's second term, he advocated for nuclear restriction laws, which we will discuss later in the conflict and compromise section. But for a quick overview, Reagan decided to support a nuclear restriction law and the removal of an entire class of nuclear missiles, those which had a range of 50 to 1,000 kilometers, and their launchers. The rest will be discussed later in the video. Next, we move on to our third topic. What effects did the nuclear riots have on the people? Now, we will discuss the effects of the nuclear freeze movement had on people. It was a widespread movement, as we have seen, and it had millions of members. However, of these millions, we will be looking at the main riot they held, the New York riot. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, went. They all went to help and fight against the construction of nuclear bombs and the oncoming nuclear war. People from Idaho and beyond drove to New York to fight for their and their children's safety. It even influenced Ronald Reagan in his choice during his second term. This riot led Reagan on the path to advocate for the nuclear restriction laws. If it weren't for the support of those involved, we may all have never existed. After the nuclear freeze riot, many new members joined, stated their own riot. The movement skyrocketed, with all the support from across the US and the oceans. The nuclear freeze changed many minds, and eventually led to a nuclear war being stopped. Now, we will move on to our final topic, the conflict and compromise that took place during these years. First, the conflict. The major conflict here was between the Reagan Association and the nuclear freeze movement. During Reagan's first term, the Reagan Association fought for the continued construction and production of nuclear missiles in preparation for an all-out war with the Soviet Union. The nuclear freeze movement wanted a complete freeze of the construction of nuclear missiles. They wanted no missile left standing throughout the entire world. To prevent both nuclear wars and nuclear monopolies, pointing a missile at someone and saying, "Give me your land or I'll destroy you," they wanted no missiles left, and the Reagan Association did not like that. They played even every dirty trick in the book. They called the people in the freeze movement communist sympathizers, that it was an organization set up by the Soviet Union to stop the Americans' nuclear missile production, etc. It was a bad situation for all of the freeze personnel. However, after Reagan saw the success the nuclear freeze riots had, he pushed for not for a total nuclear freeze, but instead nuclear restriction laws and the removal of an entire class of nuclear missiles. A treaty was made and signed approving this, and now this is the compromise. They came to a stable agreement that still kept the U.S. protected, but stopped a massive nuclear war, saving millions, if not billions. This was my NHD project on the nuclear freeze and peace activism of the 1980s. I hope you've enjoyed. This was a lot of fun and time to put this project together. I hope you enjoyed and that you have learned something. Thank you for your attention.